My dad told everyone I was his pride and joy, until I found the audio recording of him disowning me to his friends. I was cleaning out my dad's old desk drawer when I found his ancient digital recorder buried under stacks of receipts and old bills. The thing was from like 2005, one of those bulky silver devices that businessmen used to carry around. I figured it was just filled with work meetings, or maybe some old voice memos about grocery lists or home repairs. But when I pressed play, expecting to hear mundane office chatter, I heard my father's voice talking about me in a way that made my blood run cold. He was telling his drinking buddies at their weekly poker game that I was a complete disappointment and that he wished he'd never had kids. This was 3 months ago, right after I'd graduated college with honors and landed what I thought was a decent entry-level position. I remember that night clearly because I'd called him excited about my new job, and he'd congratulated me warmly, told me how proud he was of his son finally making something of himself. But here on this recording, he was saying the complete opposite to his friends. The conversation went on for almost 20 minutes, and I listened to every devastating word. He talked about how I was too soft, too sensitive, how I'd never amount to anything real in this world. He complained that I didn't play sports in high school, that I preferred reading books to working on cars with him in the garage. He said I was probably going to end up living in his basement forever, just another millennial who couldn't handle real responsibility. The worst part was hearing his friends laugh and agree with him, adding their own cruel observations about my appearance and personality. I sat there in his empty house, surrounded by boxes of his belongings, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. This was the same man who'd driven 4 hours to attend my college graduation ceremony, who'd stood up and cheered when they called my name, who'd taken me out for an expensive dinner afterward, and told the waiter that his son was graduating summa cum laude. I treasured that memory for months, replaying it whenever I felt insecure about my future or doubted my abilities. My relationship with my father had always been complicated, but I thought we'd finally found our rhythm as I entered adulthood. Growing up, he was demanding and critical, always pushing me to be better, stronger, more like the son he apparently wanted. But in recent years, especially after I'd started college, things seemed to improve between us. He'd call me regularly, ask about my classes, even seemed genuinely interested in my major and career plans. When I struggled with anxiety during my junior year, he was surprisingly supportive, encouraging me to stick with my studies and reminding me that our family didn't give up on things. The recording shattered all of that perceived progress in our relationship. I realized that every encouraging word, every proud moment, every gesture of support had been nothing more than a performance for my benefit. Behind my back, he was telling his friends that I was exactly the kind of son he was ashamed to have. The betrayal cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had, deeper than any criticism he'd ever leveled at me directly. At least when he was harsh to my face, I knew where I stood with him. I spent the next few days in a fog of confusion and hurt. I kept replaying conversations we'd had, looking for signs that I'd missed, clues that would have revealed his true feelings about me. I thought about all the times he'd bragged about me to relatives at family gatherings, all the times he'd defended my choices when other family members questioned them. Had all of that been fake too? Was I really such a disappointment that he couldn't even be honest with me about it? The worst part was that some of what he said on the recording contained grains of truth that stung, because I'd worried about the same things myself. I had been sensitive as a kid, preferring books to sports, more interested in academic pursuits than traditionally masculine activities. I'd always felt like I was letting him down in some fundamental way, like I wasn't the son he'd imagined having. But I thought we'd moved past all that he'd come to accept and even appreciate the person I'd become. I considered confronting him directly about the recording, but he'd passed away from a heart attack just 2 weeks before I found it. The timing felt cruel and deliberate, like the universe was playing some cosmic joke on me. I couldn't demand explanations or apologies from a dead man, couldn't work through this betrayal with him the way we'd worked through other conflicts in the past. I was left holding this terrible knowledge with no way to process it or resolve it. For weeks after finding the recording, I questioned everything about our relationship and everything about myself. Maybe he was right about me being too soft for the real world. Maybe I really was destined to be a disappointment, just better at hiding it than he'd given me credit for. I found myself second-guessing every decision, every interaction, wondering if other people in my life were also maintaining polite facades while secretly judging me harshly. I started avoiding family gatherings because I couldn't bear to hear relatives talking about what a good father he'd been, how much he'd loved his children, how proud he'd always been of me. Every well-meaning comment about our relationship felt like another knife twist. I wanted to scream at them that they didn't know the real him, that his pride in me had been nothing more than a careful act performed for public consumption. But then something unexpected happened when I was going through more of his belongings. I found a shoebox tucked away in his bedroom closet, filled with things I'd made for him over the years. Elementary school drawings, handmade Father's Day cards, essays I'd written in high school that I'd forgotten giving him copies of. There were also printed emails I'd sent him from college, photos of us together at various events, and even ticket stubs from a baseball game we'd attended together when I was 12. Most surprising of all was a letter I'd written him during my sophomore year of college, when I was struggling with choosing a major and feeling uncertain about my future. In that letter, I'd thanked him for always believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself, for pushing me to be better while also accepting who I was. I'd completely forgotten writing it, but there it was, carefully preserved in his private collection of mementos. The discovery of that shoebox created an even more confusing emotional landscape for me. How could the same man who'd saved every drawing I'd ever made for him, who'd kept a letter thanking him for believing in me, also tell his friends that I was a disappointment he wished he'd never had? The contradiction was so stark that it made me question whether I'd misunderstood something about the recording or about him. I started thinking about my father's own upbringing, about the stories he'd told me about his relationship with his own father. My grandfather had been a harsh man who'd shown affection through criticism and tough love, who'd believed that boys needed to be toughened up to survive in the world. My father had often talked about how he'd tried to be different with me, more supportive and understanding, but maybe he'd never fully escaped the patterns he'd learned as a child. Maybe the recording captured him in a moment of reverting to the language and attitudes he'd grown up with, especially in the company of men who shared those old-fashioned ideas about masculinity and fatherhood. Maybe talking tough about his son was his way of fitting in with his friends, of proving that he wasn't going soft in his old age. It didn't excuse what he'd said, but it provided a context that made the contradiction between his public and private words slightly more comprehensible. I realized that my father, like most people, was probably more complex than I'd given him credit for. He could genuinely love me and be proud of me while also harboring disappointments and concerns that he expressed differently depending on his audience. The recording represented one facet of his feelings, but the shoebox of mementos represented another equally valid facet. Both were real, both were true, even though they seemed to contradict each other. This revelation didn't make the hurt go away, but it did help me understand that the situation was more nuanced than I'd initially thought. My father wasn't simply a liar who'd been faking his affection for me, nor was he simply a loving parent who'd been misrepresented by one unfortunate recording. He was a complicated person with complicated feelings, trying to navigate relationships and expectations in ways that sometimes contradicted each other. I decided to focus on the tangible evidence of his love and pride, rather than the words he'd spoken in what he thought was a private moment. The shoebox full of keepsakes told a story of a father who'd treasured his relationship with his son, who'd saved every small gesture of affection, who'd valued our connection enough to preserve physical reminders of it. That felt more real and more lasting than anything he might have said to impress his poker buddies. Months later, I was helping my mom sort through more of his belongings when we found another recording device, this one containing voice memos he'd made for himself during his final year. In these recordings, he talked about his regrets and his hopes for the future, including several long passages about how proud he was of the man I'd become. He worried that he'd been too hard on me as a child, that he'd pushed me too much to be someone I wasn't instead of celebrating who I actually was. In one particularly moving memo, he talked about watching me graduate from college and feeling overwhelmed with pride and love. He said he'd wanted to tell me that day how much he admired my intelligence, my kindness, my determination to succeed on my own terms rather than his. But he'd been afraid that too much praise might make me complacent, so he'd held back some of his feelings. He regretted that restraint and planned to be more open with his affection in the future. This second recording provided the missing piece of the puzzle, showing me that my father's relationship with expressing emotions was complicated and sometimes contradictory. He'd grown up in an era when men weren't supposed to show vulnerability or sentimentality, when tough love was considered the only acceptable way to raise strong children. But he'd also recognized that those old patterns weren't always helpful or healthy, and he'd been trying to find a better balance. The poker game recording, I realized, might have been his way of maintaining credibility with friends who shared his generational attitudes about masculinity, while privately grappling with more complex feelings about fatherhood. It didn't excuse the hurtful things he'd said, but it explained them in a way that allowed me to forgive him and move forward. I still think about that first recording sometimes, and it still stings to remember those cruel words. But I also think about the shoebox of mementos, the voice memos full of love and regret, and all the tangible ways he'd shown his pride in me over the years. The complete picture is more complicated than either recording alone would suggest, but it's also more human and more real. My father wasn't perfect, and our relationship wasn't perfect either. He struggled with expressing emotions, with living up to changing expectations about masculinity and fatherhood, with balancing his own upbringing against his desire to be a better parent. But he loved me deeply, even when he couldn't express it perfectly, even when he sometimes said things that contradicted that love. Learning to hold both truths simultaneously, the disappointment and the pride, the criticism and the love, has been one of the most difficult but important lessons of my adult life. People are complex, relationships are messy, and sometimes the people we love most are also the ones capable of hurting us most deeply. But that doesn't mean the love isn't real or isn't worth treasuring. I've kept both recordings, along with the shoebox of mementos, as reminders of the full complexity of my relationship with my father. They serve as a testament to the fact that love and disappointment can coexist, that people can hold contradictory feelings about the same person, that the human heart is vast enough to contain multitudes of emotions simultaneously. The experience has also taught me to be more careful about my own words and actions, to consider how the things I say in private might affect the people I love if they were to hear them. I've learned to be more direct about expressing affection and pride, to avoid the kind of emotional compartmentalization that led my father to say loving things to my face while expressing disappointment behind my back. Most importantly, I've learned to judge relationships based on the full scope of actions and words, rather than isolated moments or conversations. The recording of my father disowning me to his friends was real and painful, but it was just one piece of a much larger and more complex story. The love he showed me, the pride he expressed, the care he took in preserving our memories together, those were also real and perhaps more representative of his true feelings. In the end, I choose to remember him as a flawed but loving father who struggled with expressing his emotions perfectly, but who cared deeply about his son. The hurt from that recording will always be part of our story, but it doesn't define our entire relationship or negate all the good that existed between us. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is learn to live with contradictions, to accept that people and relationships are more complex than we'd like them to be. I miss him every day, despite everything, and I'm grateful for the chance to have known him in all his complexity. The recordings, both painful and beautiful, have given me a deeper understanding of who he was as a person and as a father. That understanding has been worth the pain of discovery, worth the confusion and hurt that came with learning that the people we love most are often the most complicated to understand.